Teachers of Reddit, what is your "this student is so smart it's scary" story? Story 1. I teach gifted and talented first and second graders. I have had a lot of very smart students over the years, some with amazing sense where they can understand most math concepts before I teach it. For example, they see the connections between multiplication and equivalent fractions and immediately can simplify or find greatest common factors. Several read at the high school level, but maybe don't really get the social context of what they're reading. Usually, I can maintain some control in the classroom because they are 7 or 8 and I am an adult and have been teaching kids like them for years. This year, I have one little girl who writes beautifully. She's very talented. But that's all she wants to do. While I enjoy talking with her about her craft and helping her think of good transition for the scenes in her stories, these are the types of questions she has for me. I also have to teach her math and teach the rest of the class too. Recently, she's been going through some challenging emotions. She gets angry at others, lashes out, and has been defiant with adults. So she was arguing with me about having to do a math problem or equivalent fractions or something like that, when she's already demonstrated mastery of the skill. I think she's heard me use this phrase in reference to her spelling. She's passed out of spelling. Honestly, she caught me off guard. So I said, fine, show me you can do these 3 problems and we'll call it good. So she did, and she got what she wanted. I realized later what she did. She's right. Really, if you can demonstrate mastery, you don't need more practice. So now she tries this with everything and every skill she doesn't particularly like. She's exhausting, but she's fun to mentally spar with. I have many students who are smarter than I am, but she's the first one to outmaneuver me. Story 2. Not a teacher, but a guitar instructor. When I was 15, I taught a little guy, about 8, some basic tips in how to read tabs as one of my first quote-unquote students. He went on to get insanely good within the next few weeks, like to where I was intimidated and thrown off guard. He was just outside my house all day, practicing. Whenever I went outside for anything, he'd hammer me with a billion questions about technique and strumming patterns, but goodness was he good. He had never even held a guitar before I taught him how. Absolute prodigy. Story 3. I had a first grader with a speech impediment who was asking for a type of book. His peers and I couldn't understand him no matter how hard we tried. Finally, he gave up, and without any frustration, he found a picture book with someone stirring a pot on the cover. He opened the book and skimmed through words until he found what he was looking for, the word cooking. He showed me the book and pointed, telling me that this was the word he had been trying to say. He wanted a cookbook. This was a 6-year-old. 6! Story 4. I taught high school math. One of my freshman students divided 1134 by 63 in his head in less than a second. I let him finish the problem, and then after he arrived at his answer, I asked him, "How did you do that?" He looked at me with this blank stare as if he was thinking, "You can't do that." He proceeded to say, "Well, I doubled 63 and then multiplied that by 10, and then I saw that 1134 was just the difference of those two numbers, so 18. Looked at me like it was nothing. I told him, "Good work," and moved on. I'm only above average at a few things, but one of them is mental math. When I saw that this kid could do this calculation so easily, I was happy. It was one of my happiest moments as a teacher. I didn't help him in that moment, but I played a small part in his math education, and it felt real good. Story 5. I'm a piano teacher on the side, teaching a 4-year-old how to read sheet music before she can read books. I ask her to find the C's and she will point them out on the page, etc. She can also do math really well and understands the concepts of multiplication. Also, another student that just started and plays by ear and composes her own pieces at 8. She also speaks 5 languages, which I didn't find out until I told her I was learning German. After teaching her for 3 months, she already is to the point where I had to send her to a better teacher. Story 6. We had a 4-year-old in preschool. He was sitting under the table writing down numbers for a long time. He had no time to talk to us. When he came out and we looked at what he had been doing, he said he wrote down all the multiplications. It turns out his brother in 5th grade was learning the multiplication table, and this little brother really wanted to do the same thing, but did not have a multiplication table. He counted on his fingers to add each column and got the table right. A few days later, he knew multiplication. He would also comment on dates. If someone told them that he had a birthday on June 12th, he would say, "That is in 184 days," almost immediately. On an excursion, we passed some statues with birth and death dates, and he would casually sum up, "He was 78 years and 110 days old. She was born 33 years and 120 days before him," etc. I think he was maybe more focused and willing to understand than necessarily so smart. Story 7. I was a student teacher at the time, completing my education degree. I taught 8th grade. There was this one girl who was your typical edgy, angsty 13-year-old who was too cool for everything. When we went through our poetry unit, we gave a project in which the kids had to write their own free-form poem and put it to some sort of video or slideshow. This girl wrote a poem about how the United States education system, as it stifles creativity and destroys students' joy of learning. I always remember this one line from her poem. I learned more from an evening watching Hamilton on stage than an entire year in a United States history class. The video was your typical angsty black and white shots of her friends standing solemnly in front of her behind chain link fences and signs that say, "No trespassing." The next day, she showed up with a gigantic biography of Alexander Hamilton. It was bigger than most Bibles. It only took her a week to read it. My mentor teacher hated her because she thought the student thought she was smarter than everyone else and was arrogant. Maybe she did think that, maybe she thought we were annoying simpletons, but I just thought she was a dope. This kid didn't particularly like or dislike me, hated my mentor teacher, and disliked anyone except a couple friends. She was sassy. She was smart. She had finely tuned meter, if you know what I mean. She had a huge vocabulary and an obvious love of learning. She'd grill out book after book, and where my mentor teacher saw arrogance in her poem project, I just saw a girl who was desperately bored and was asking for a challenge. I tried my best to give her extra, more challenging options. In the future, for her assignments, she never said anything to me, but I got the feeling she appreciated it. Or, I hope she did. Story 8. My mom had a special needs student who went on some field trip to one of the NASA centers. I don't remember where. His dad was an IT guy, I think, and had been teaching the kid, around 10 years old, I think, stuff on the side because he was all about computers. Kid wandered off and apparently found some office or computer lab or something unlocked. Walked in, sat down at a computer, figured out how to unlock the terminal, and started browsing through their internal stuff for a while before someone even caught him. He got in big trouble for that one, but I don't even know if it registered in his mind what a huge issue that could be. He would do it at school and nobody cared too much, so I don't think he saw an issue doing it out in the real world. He came to my mom the next year or the year after that when his family moved, and my mom was warned not to leave her personal electronics unattended because he would figure out how to get in. Story 9. I had a student maybe 5 to 6 years ago. I teach social studies, so she didn't come in direct contact with my area of study, but she was truly special. Anyways, she could speak 5 languages pretty fluently. English is her native. She learned French in middle school, taught herself Russian and Italian for the sake of reading, and learned Indonesian from being around kids in the school and wanted to pick it up. She could write music just from hearing it, then reproduce it with essentially no time at all. I don't know if this is common or not, but it absolutely shocked me. She's, bar none, the best student I've seen as a teacher with regards to conveying herself through written work. She graduated just a few weeks after turning 16. One of those kids who effortlessly glides to the top of her class. Last I heard, she was about to graduate in something related to archaeology. Story 10. I teach ESL in China and have this one 7-year-old student who remembers everything. He will read a word or a sentence and then remember it a year later and point it out in his book. I had forgotten it. I will say a word and he pronounces it perfectly and always will. He speaks better than my daughter and he has a large vocabulary as well. I like him most because he understands what he is saying, reading, and hearing. He will often pre-read and understand it without being told. He would brag and ask embarrassing questions until I told him that he should be trying to help the other students and that making them feel bad slows them down. Now he helps the others understand the material. It's great. Story 11. I had a student with autism who could calculate trigonometry ratios in his head to several decimal places. We could ask, "Hey George, what's the sine of 62? George would take a few seconds and shout, 0.88295. I have never figured out how he did it without a calculator. He had violent outbursts and terrible social skills. He's been in and out of jail since high school, and I've lost track of him over the years. It's really sad, but man, what a genius. Story 12. I've had a few different super smart kiddos. One student of mine with autism could, when given any date from the 1900s or 2000s, tell you what the day of the week was. He tried to explain to us how he knew once, but the explanation didn't make sense to any of us. Another student of mine was hyperlexic, essentially the opposite of dyslexia. He could write well above his grade level and read any word you put in front of him. We once gave him one of our college textbooks and he read it back to us. Didn't understand it, but pronounced every word correctly and read it fluently. He was a first grader. Finally, I recently had a second grader who had already mastered the entirety of the 5th grade math curriculum and everything before that. His previous teacher didn't know what to do with him, so she put him on Khan Academy all the time. I did what I could, but it's hard to keep up with kids so far above grade level. Story 13. I was doing a 500-piece puzzle with some kids. I was a preschool teacher. We finished the puzzle except for one piece, which was nowhere to be found. Kid comes in, takes one look at the puzzle on the table, says, "Oh, are you missing that? I know where it is." Reaches into another completely different 500-piece puzzle, rummages for like 10 seconds, pulls the piece out, fits it in. I asked him how he knew it was there. He said he had done the other puzzle for a bit and noticed it. I asked him how long ago. Christmas, he says. It was February at the time. Kid was maybe 5. Might be more memory than intelligence, but that was crazy to see. Such a great kid in a somewhat dire circumstance. I hope he's gotten all the opportunities he deserves. Story 14. I have a student who can tell you what day of the week any historical date was at a moment's notice. The class and I sat there for 10 minutes asking him what day random historical dates were and then checking them on Google. February 12th, 1947. No problem, that was X Day. August 1st, 1709. Definitely a Thursday. We were blown away and quite impressed. Story 15. I had a first grade student who was obsessed with planes. He knew how to recognize the brands, knew serial numbers, what were special about them and how they flew. He could draw detailed planes from memory starting from anywhere. One day I'm sitting, he comes up to me and shoves his children's picture book in my face and says, "Look at this plane, brand name, serial number." I nod. He looks at me with horror. "It should have 4 motors. This plane only has 2. Without the other 2, this plane just can't fly." Utter disbelief and shock. Then just swirls around and goes off on his way with his little picture book. I also had his brother the next year. Looked like twins, but polar opposites in personality. Smart as well, but no particular obsession. He would rarely speak. Sat like a ghost hovering in the back of the class, but boy, when he opened his mouth, it would be these drops of knowledge that would come out of nowhere. He never wasted his breath or energy for nothing. Story 16. I taught elementary age kids on the autism spectrum and had a few students who made my days interesting. One kid could read any keystrokes we were typing from across the room. We had to call IT at least once a week to change the password to access YouTube because he kept figuring it out. Another kid really loved pulling the fire alarm because it made an awesome sound and all the fire trucks would show up. We tried implementing a behavior plan where he'd get a reward at the end of the day if he made it through school without lunging at the fire alarm. He'd make it through the day, get his reward, and then immediately pull the fire alarm on the way out of school for the day. Another kid was obsessed with memorizing birthdays. He memorized mine and all of my family members' birthdays. Once in class in the middle of a lesson, he raises his hand and lets me know that my mom's birthday was coming up in a few days. Story 17. I'm a teacher and my own youngest son is crazy smart. I teach special education, so there is no correlation, but when my son was in 1st grade, he was helping his brother, who is also extremely bright, do his 6th grade math. My youngest is now 17 and is a dual-credit high school/college student, taking such things as pre-calculus at the college level. He taught himself to code and is on the high school robotics team. He seems to learn things by osmosis. When he was 3 years old, I would ask him how he knew the things that he knew, and he would just shrug his shoulders and tell me that he just knew them. I don't know where he learned this stuff. I certainly am no math whiz. Story 18. Not a teacher. I'm a student, but I still think this is a crazy story. I'm a senior in high school and I'm taking a pre-calculus course. A kid who's new in the school sits in my class at my table. We're forced to sit at a 4-person table for math. Majority of the first few weeks were just review from the last year. But after that, we moved on to this unit about radians. If you know anything about radians, you know you have to pay pretty good attention or you'll be lost. And it's the basis for most of the stuff taught in pre-calc. At least it is at my school. For the first 2 weeks of the unit, we just worked in groups and classwork to learn the material. This whole time, the new kid was gone from school. We didn't know if he was on vacation or sick or he was just gone. On the Friday of the individual test, he walks into the class. The teacher tells him he doesn't have to take the test. Obviously, the kids ask for the test. He says something like, "Just want to see what I can do." This kid turns in the test in 20 minutes. The next Monday, we found out he was the only one in the class who got an A on that test. You'd think he's from a different school. They probably already learned this stuff. Nope. My school district has 3 high schools. He came from another school in my district. They have the same exact curriculum. He never took this class before in school. I have no explanation for this other than maybe math is a hobby of his and he did studying outside of school. Or one of his parents is a math teacher or something. I really don't know, but it's kind of freaked me out that this kid even exists. Story 19. I worked as a substitute teacher at a high school a long time ago, and I wound up getting the same girl in class multiple times over several years. Most notably, I subbed in for the school's AP bio teacher for 4 months. She clearly had problems at home, and maybe mental problems as well, I don't know. Her clothes were always really ratty, and everything about her just screamed child neglect. She didn't seem to have any friends, and she was super awkward whenever you talked to her. She was also one of those smart kids that wind up bored with school, that she just checks out completely at some point. By the time I got her in high school, she never did homework and rarely did in-class assignments, and she almost never paid any attention to the lesson at all. She did just enough work to pass, you know? She just sat in the back and read or drew in her sketchbooks. Often the books she was reading were things like college textbooks or books in various foreign languages. It was always kind of interesting to see what she was reading. She was an astonishingly fast reader. She'd burn through reading assignments in 5 minutes that took the rest of the class almost an hour to do, and she'd understand them when the rest of the class was struggling. Initially, I wrote her off as just being a slacker until I subbed for that AP bio class. Every test I gave out, she'd get every question right, and her essay answers were absolutely flawless and often really interesting. The first time this shocked me completely because, again, this was a student that never did any work and never paid attention at all. She just blitzed through the test twice as fast as everyone else and got a perfect score when even the best and brightest students were struggling to get B's. When the AP test came around, she took several, including some for subjects she didn't even take the class for. And as far as I know, she got a 5 on all of them. I'm sure her ACT and SAT scores were equally amazing. I don't know what made her so smart. She clearly had an amazing memory and was just, smarter than the average kid, I guess. Or smarter in some ways. I've kept track of her on social media over the years. She never went to college, and for a while it looked like she was just going to burn out completely. It was pretty sad, really. But eventually things turned out. She owns a company now and seems to be pretty darn successful. Story 20. Okay, I'm going to shamelessly brag about this kid. For the record, I teach high school Spanish. We'll call this kid Jason because that's nothing like his real name and I don't want to break FERPA. Jason played basketball and soccer. He was in art club and beta club and National Honor Society. He was even the valedictorian. Jason basically taught himself Spanish 1, and by the time he got to my Spanish 2 class, had vastly surpassed his classmates. He asked great questions and even caused me to learn quite a few things about the subject. His Spanish was super impeccable. He never made even a single B in my class. When we played games, his teams always won. He studied hard, he was focused, and he was so stupid affable. And he was like this in every single way, including the AP classes. He went on to the best college in the state, full ride. He's done study abroad in several countries, and he's been recognized several times in the school's magazine. And not a single person has a negative thing to say about him. He's so genuine and good. He's a serious, preppy white boy that gets along with everyone. The athletes, the nerds, the goth, the emo, the freestyle. I've gotten off track with the question, but he just makes me so darn proud. Jason is an actual genius. Story 21. I'm a substitute teacher and I went to cover a middle school math class. There was one very shy, kind of awkward kid who was working on an assignment involving square roots. Without using a calculator, that kid was coming up with answers left and right. I thought I was some kind of joke or prank, but for the heck of it, I took out my phone's calculator and asked him to multiply different 3 or 4-digit numbers. Without batting an eyelash, this kid would give me the answers almost as quickly as I could ask the question. A few occasions he had to recalculate things in his head once or twice, but it was scary how quickly his answers came. I asked him what it was like, and he said that it was like having a tiny room inside his head filled with whiteboards. You can go inside the room to work on calculations. To this day, I have not met another kid like him. Story 22. I've taught a lot of smart kids, and while these 2 stories may not be the most genius kids, I mean, maybe they were, but I can't really tell. They're good stories. One was a little boy I had when I taught first grade. At that age, he figured out that the squares of numbers and always end in a pattern 0, 1, 4, 9, 6, 5, 6, 9, 4, 1, and repeat. He asked me what that was called, and I didn't even know it was a thing. I spent most of his first grade year trying to teach him how to not be so obvious when he thought people were wasting his time. The kid could already read and do math, but he did not yet know how to control his eye rolling. That was sincerely the most useful skill I could teach him. The other was a girl I taught in 6th grade. A couple of years ago, her parents had homeschooled her for a while, and basically she just learned whatever she wanted to learn. That worked for my class, so she did random reports on the history of Chinese food or essays about her grandmother or whatever. Just recently, she was part of a young composer's workshop, and I got to see professional musicians perform her work. She's 13. The thing is, geniuses don't always do stereotypically genius things. The boy from the first story is now attending a pretty average state university. I'm sure he will always be smart and always be great at what he does. but that super amazing genius thing is only one aspect of a person. Story 23. Once, last year, I had a kid that was academically smarter than most, which happens from time to time. What really stood out to me was his critical thinking and ability and reasoning skills. We would read novels as he would pick up on some of the subtle points, some that 2 or 3 reads in I still hadn't picked up on myself. And he could relate books to other subjects as well. There were some times where we could just be chatting about books we had both read, and I was struggling to keep up. It was honestly a wonderful thing having someone like that in class, so I focused on how he presented those ideas. He was a good writer, but still struggled on how to clearly put his thoughts on paper, so we worked on that a lot. Story 24. Back when I was teaching computer science at a high school, there was this quiet kid named Alex. He hardly ever participated in the class discussions, but aced every test and assignments effortlessly. One day we had a special project where students had to write a complex algorithm to solve a simulated problem. Alex turned his project in early, and when I reviewed it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. His code wasn't just correct, it was elegant and efficient beyond what I'd expect from a high schooler. Curious, I asked him how he managed to come up with such a solution. He shrugged nonchalantly and explained that he had spent the weekend reading research papers and learning advanced algorithms online. Turns out, he'd even optimized the problem further than I thought possible. It was a humbling experience to see someone so young grasp concepts that most professionals struggle with. Story 25. I work in before and after school care and work with a kid who has an amazing eye for science. The first sign of him being pretty intelligent was when he was 5 and he was playing by himself. He showed me that he had made a castle with a working drawbridge out of cardboard and string. Even his fine motor skills in cutting and designing this thing were far beyond the other kids his age, let alone the fact that no one had shown him how to do anything of the sort. Next was when I was talking to the kids as a group. He wasn't listening and kept pulling things off the shelf to play with and make buildings out of. I held him back as he needed to know the information I'd given the other kids as well. And he was able to immediately repeat verbatim what I had said 5 minutes before when it appeared he hadn't been listening at all, totally casual, while still trying to balance random toys on each other. I had a huge soft spot for this kid and worked with him for a few years after that. He was known as a troublemaker, and his parents would frequently ask if I thought he was stupid or retarded, their words, not mine, mentally or socially challenged. They were lovely and had good intentions, but the school was telling them that he was doing very poorly and they wanted him diagnosed with some sort of learning difficulties or ADHD. When forced to do what the class was doing, it seemed that he failed pretty miserably. But when in my care, he was allowed to do what he was interested in, and darn did he flourish. As I was in charge of the purchasing, I would always make sure that there were some robotics kits and other science activities that he could work with. He loved those, but would still often just come up with his own inventions using craft supplies, often projectiles, so we had a pretty common discussion that went along the lines of me saying, "Hey, that is awesome. What are you going to do with it for me?" With an immediate response of, not pointed at anyone, especially their faces, even if it's not loaded. Some of my staff really struggled with him, and it took a lot of supplies and convincing that if he was up to mischief, it was because he was bored, and then he needed something to occupy his big mind. Honestly, overall, he was such a good kid and did fantastically well, given the fact that he didn't really have anyone to support him and give him an outlet for his intelligence. His parents just didn't know what to do with him, and the school obviously didn't give them the support or knowledge they needed to raise a gifted child. Last I heard, they were gearing up for diagnosis, and I was doing my best to remind his parents that even if he does indeed have something like ADHD or autism, doesn't mean that he is not intelligent, and doesn't mean that he should be used by the school as an excuse not to teach him. All the while, he's off in the background, redesigning a toy roller coaster to use its own momentum to self-relaunch in an endless loop. Story 26. Teaching elementary science, I had a third grader who blew my mind with his knowledge of dinosaurs. He could name every species I threw at him, and not just the popular ones like T-Rex or Triceratops. He knew the obscure ones too, like Microraptor and Therizinosaurus. His passion for paleontology was contagious, and he even taught his classmates about fossils during show and tell. Story 27. I'm a teacher. For the most part, the wicked smart students tend to have learning disabilities, believe it or not. I taught a kid who scored higher than 99.9% of anyone else in his age group, who regularly produced C's and some B's in class because of his LD. I loved talking to him, but he was always a bit of a challenge in class because he tended to make very bad choices. That said, as a teacher, my first-year-old son is, to this point, head and shoulders more intelligent than any kid his age, and I've seen it. He is a phenomenal reader, is an incredibly creative artist/builder, and he can do things in math that some of my 7th grade students would struggle at. I'm really looking forward to it, watching him progress through the grades to see where he takes his gifts and what he does with them. Story 28. I teach special ed, and people talk about savantism when it comes to Asperger's and autism, but the truth is that only really happens once in a blue moon. Well, I was lucky enough to teach a kid who was the genuine article. His grades were tops, and he taught himself programming in Japanese so he could go to Japan one day and make video games. We would spend his free time talking about astrophysics and recent documentaries. Every now and then, he would ask me about something he had just absorbed and want to explain it in many details. I just tried to keep up and ask him questions that kept him thinking about what his new information meant in context and what the big picture of the universe was, or life, or gaming, or social interaction. Unfortunately, the kid had no ability to emotionally regulate, because that's just how that condition hits some people. Loud noise and unclear rules could send him into a super crazy rage. There was one classroom that he couldn't go into because he could hear the electric hum in the lights, and he bothered him to violence. I mostly just taught him coping mechanisms and being honest about his feelings so he could tell when he needed to leave a situation. Oh, and I taught him poker. He liked the math because the probability that I used exaggerated bluffing to teach him facial expressions. Great kid. I'm excited to learn what he goes on to do. Story 29. Taught a class for high school students, top 150 students in the districts of like 4K per grade. Lots of smart kids, but mostly hard workers whose parents had been coaching them on how to learn since forever. But one year, people started warning me about a kid that was coming in. He was supposed to be off the charts smart. Teaching these classes, the genius terms gets thrown around for the top 5 to 10 kids every year. So I mostly roll my eyes and don't think too much about it. Met the kid and he seemed normal. I gave him a hard time about being smart and he said it was only math. I just started early. I'm not smarter than anyone else, he said. Then I find out he was taking advanced college maths in middle school. Oh sure, just started early. But he was clearly on a different level in English as well. Never any errors in his essays and always wonderful analysis of complex ideas explained in simple and clear terms. When discussing novels, his analysis was stuff I remember my professors pointing out to me when I was in college. A lot of the time it was stuff I missed or only got my 3rd or 4th year teaching it. It felt like he had some cheat code enabled or something. He remembered nearly everything and synthesized information really fast and in great depth. Wonderful kid, too. Very humble, and if you didn't know him, you'd think he was normal. I hope he does great things with his gifts. Story 30. I once taught a girl who was a genius. She showed it in many ways, but one always stuck out. This was an A-level physics class, UK, so 17 to 18 years old, and for a piece of homework, there was one question that should take them about half a page of working to solve. It was a proof, so they knew what the answer was, but they had to figure it out themselves using the input data, selecting the right equations, and then showing all the working. She turned in her homework and said, "Sir, I've got the right answer, but I'm not quite certain how I got there." What she meant was, she knew what she'd done was right, but it didn't match the solution she was supposed to have. I took a look at it. It's about 4 pages of working, which ends up about the right numbers. I tell her, "I'm going to have to look into this overnight and get back to you." So I took it home and had a good read. Turns out that instead of using the given equation, she'd refigured out the same equations from first principles. She'd started with the basics, fundamental principles, and figured out the same equations that the original scientists did, but she did it overnight. I explained what she'd done in the next day, and she responded with, "Again? Oh, I don't get all the marks that way." And she was right. She wouldn't usually get the marks because it wasn't what was the mark in the scheme. I awarded her full marks. Story 31. Actual teacher here. I have had several students this year who are very smart and in a gifted program. I teach math, so of course all the smart kids ask me for extra work, etc. This year I have an actual genius in my class, only he has completely flown under the radar until this year. His father went to jail this year and he has an ESL student. I think because of his lack of knowledge in English, it was never assumed he was so smart. I discovered it about 2 weeks ago and I'm in the process of getting him services. We had to give tests to see where the kids were in relation to grade level. I gave a test that spanned from 1st to 12th grade math questions. I teach 5th. The kid aced the test. I'm taking geometry and algebraic equations for seniors in high school. I was floored. I then gave him some extra homework with some college-level problems and he passed. This is a kid with a broken home life and his parents don't speak English. He barely speaks English and he is killing it in math. I brought it to the attention of my SAT team and they said his reading and writing scores are not at grade level, so that it is why he didn't receive gifted services. I'm trying to change that because he needs to be challenged. In the meantime, I'm brushing up on my advanced mathematics to help him. Story 32. I once had a girl who would understand everything I explained at once every single time, while the rest of the class did obviously not. Her homework was brilliant. It got to a point where she seemed to know the lessons better than some teachers did. Not surprisingly, I found out her IQ score was a genius high. She moved to a different school, so I never saw her again. I hope she's making the world a better place. We surely need it. Wow, I wasn't expecting so much attention. I'll try to answer your questions here. She was already a teen. Apparently, her family moved a lot. I did Google her, but nothing. Maybe she changed her name. It was the Wechsler IQ test. Some of the subjects I taught were quite hard, hence my obviously remark. Typically, I would have to give several examples to make sure everyone followed. I've had the whole spectrum from borderline to gifted children. I'm very proud of my career as a teacher. I can't count the times I've been told I was the best teacher someone ever had. I have the satisfaction of knowing I have turned around someone's life just by slowly building up their confidence. A kid who thinks he or she is dumb and good for nothing is something I cannot stand. Not only the smartest succeed, life is a recipe with countless ingredients. Story 33. Yes, his name was Thomas. A lot of kids called him Edison because he was a pure genius. Math, English, history, science, and reading was a breeze for him. I teach high school history and AP history. He was like a little Hermione Granger in my class. He always asked me what subjects I was going to teach next year, because he wanted to study them during the summer to get a head start, and every year he knew what was going to come out of my mouth. Thomas always knew the answer, passed every test with flying colors. He was so smart. His college algebra teacher had to give him complex math problems during class to keep him still. He would stare at the workbook for 5 seconds and do the classwork and homework in under 10 minutes. The complex math problems would at least take him the whole class period to complete. I think his science teacher made him memorize the periodic table and all the atoms elements. But this poor kid was the messiest person I ever met. His backpack was a black hole of wonder, full of mystery and clutter. And he couldn't talk to females. He was not half bad-looking kid, and with his brains, a lot of girls liked him. He could explain for hours on Marie Curie radiation studies to us, but couldn't speak 4 words to the opposite sex. Well, after graduation and to speech about Elon Musk, his parents moved back to England, and Thomas started school at Oxford University, probably still yapping on Rosalind Franklin DNA picture and stuttering at the sights of women. I miss Thomas's daily, "Did you hear what Musk is up to?" conversation. Story 34. Yes, once, 4th grader. I give a math problem that involves powers of 10 early in the year, and I'm walking the room checking out their work. This kid is doing things with factorials and square roots. I said to him, "I think you're thinking too hard about this one." He blinks and slaps his head and goes, "Oh, 9989, duh! 9989 being the correct answer to the problem that takes most kids an hour to solve." He did it in his head in the blink of an eye. So he was good at math, but he was also on a level beyond everyone else in reading too. He could find subtle symbols and put together really complex interpretations of books that were backed by text. He had a really deep knowledge of Greek, Chinese, and Indian mythology. I would say that he would be able to pass a high school English lit class. He thought it was a lot smarter than I am and always wanted to talk to me about CRISPR and all of the implications of it and how it's going to be so simple that we're going to be able to use it in classrooms. He told me he'll show me how to do it one day in the future. I plan to hold him to that. I also remember a conversation where he had about ethics of eating meat, and he told me that he had been reading some Peter Singer with his dad. I thought that was really cool. He was just a really curious kid, total slob. Spilling off the desk and backpack, losing things all the time, never did his homework, disorganized, but he was so smart, it didn't really matter. He'd usually pay attention in class unless he was deep into a book, in which case, forget it. He made friends just fine and wasn't even really friends with the other brainy kids. His parents were smart, though not as smart as him, but very level-headed. They were aware of how smart he was and would ask me for advice on how to foster his intelligence without putting undue pressure on him. They didn't want him to lose his sense of curiosity or get caught up in the rat race that school can be in a high-performing area. It was cool teaching him. It was a challenge for me to continue to challenge him, but I came up with a few ideas and he came up with a few of his own to keep himself occupied while in school. But it was a lot of fun. You feel a responsibility when you have a kid like that he could be the one to really make an impact on the world, And in such formative years, you have an obligation to foster his development. Story 35. I taught at the same law school I previously attended. I did not encounter any obviously naturally talented students, just varying degrees of hard workers. But one of the professors was a clear natural genius. When I was a student, I took her class along with about 80 other students, intimidating, commanding, quick-thinking women of poise and confidence. On the first day, she asked us to stay in the same seats every day until she could memorize all of our names. On the second day, she said, "I think I've got all your names memorized." And she proceeded to name everyone in the class correctly, starting from the front to the back. That's when you know the bar is going to be pretty darn high. When she became a colleague rather than my teacher, she visited me when I was clerking for a certain federal judge in D.C. The judge and I go along excellently. We have the same dry sense of humor, often trading thoughts without words. I introduced my genius former professor to my esteemed judge. a meeting of intellectual titans. After the meeting, I went to lunch with the professor and she suddenly got quiet. Then she leaned forward to confess to me, "So the judge, he's a pretty intimidating guy, huh?" I chuckled and nodded along, but my honest thought was, no, he's great. I thought, how can you be scared of him? I'm not scared of him. I'm scared of you. That's when my mind was blown and I realized for the first time that this intimidating genius woman was no longer my teacher. She was now my peer. It changed the way I saw myself as a professional and the way I saw the smartest people I knew. For the rest of my life, I knew I can do this, and I went on to do the same teaching myself. Story 36. I teach at a school for gifted kids, but even among a smart population, there are a couple of students who stand out. The one that stands out the most is 7. He takes calculus as his math class, but also spends time with a math magician, where they invent new types of numbers in number theory. He is developing at their known as possible loop numbers. He's also very hyperactive and takes breaks outside of the classroom to calm himself. One day when he was taking a break, he asked for a piece of paper, then proceeded to write out the entire periodic table, chemical symbol, name, atomic weight, electron valences, everything, then stood up and went back to class. He also had a fantastic sense of humor and loves any sort of math joke. What's a tuna fish plus tuna fish? Fornifish! It's not just the things he knows that makes him a genius, though. He perceives the world differently than other people. He can become so engrossed in topics that he's basically running up a funnel, reaching more higher and higher understanding. He lives very intensely, and I can be overwhelmed easily. Last year, I was teaching his class cell biology, and that day I told them that it was an awesome organelle with a cool name, the endoplasmic reticulum. He raised his hand to ask, "Yeah, but are we talking about smooth or rough endoplasmic reticulum?" That sums up the most of the interactions with him. Story 37. I'm not a teacher, but my little sister is a genius. At 2 years old, she was reading June B. Jones out loud on her potty training chair. Nobody knew how, but she had taught herself to read. We discovered this when we were donating some of my old books from when I was in 4th grade. And at 1, she'd pull them out and read the titles. So we decided to keep them and read them with her. Then she began reading to us. At 6, she knew all the Latin scientific names for animals. And now she's 8. She got in trouble for cussing, but learned how to speak Japanese to still cuss us out and get away with it. We don't bother yelling at her, and if it's another language, because cussing was her motivation to learn them, and that's pretty darn impressive. She translates theme songs to her favorite cartoons in Japanese. If there's an option to select a different audio language on her cartoons, she'll watch the same episode in every language. She even sleep talks in different languages. She started talking to a little girl in a foreign family in their language once in line at a zoo. I think it was Hungarian. Anyway, she's got autism, so it's hard to teach her things because she only learns what she wants to on her own. She still won't tie her shoes, not because she can't, but because she doesn't want to learn. Laces are an inconvenience when there's no Velcro, I guess. She's got a photographic memory, too. Darn, she's cool. Story 38. Never had him as a student, but I've known him for years because of Science Olympiad. For those that have never heard of it, it's a science competition with 15 students doing 23 events that encompass different areas of science. Some are test events, my specialty, in areas like ecology, circuits, anatomy, astronomy, and so on. Some are identification events like fossils, rocks, and minerals, and forestry, where you get samples you have to identify and then answer questions about my other specialty. And then there are tech events where you have to build something based on certain specs to accomplish a certain goal, like a bridge that can hold a certain weight while also being light, or an electric-powered vehicle that can go a variable distance and stop. I did Science Olympiad for years and have been assistant coach since I graduated high school. Now I'm assistant coach at the school I teach at. You can imagine that the kids who do this club already are among the brightest. This was a national level team, but this kid is something special. He did fossils and rocks and minerals for years, and since those are best events, I spent a lot of time training him. He'd remember everything I said. I'd never have to repeat myself. It got to the point where even as a 7th grader, I ran out of stuff to teach him. I was in grad school at the time, so I just started going over some of the crystal chemistry stuff I was learning just for the fun of it. He understood it and was able to explain it back to me. We also played 20 questions on a long bus ride, and he guessed whiptail lizard in 3 guesses. His questions were, is it a reptile? And then, does it reproduce parthenogenically? He's going to be a senior now, and if he can overcome his laziness, I think he can do great things. Story 39. A few years ago, I taught a kid in elementary school Latin, had her 3rd through 5th grade, who was unbelievable. I was pretty sure she had an eidetic memory, and she had just jumped to the end of every lesson after like 2 minutes. She anticipated where my instruction was going and was instantly there. I kept trying to challenge her, but honestly, it was hard. She just grasped everything at once with little to no explanation. I was talking about her to the music teacher, who said, I don't know what to do with her. She has perfect pitch. I tried to talk to her into studying the piano or violin, but she wants to learn the saxophone. She's going to Duke University as a freshman this year on a scholarship, and I expect to hear her name in the future. No doubt about it. Story 40. I had an exceptionally brilliant but socially challenged student who reminded me a lot of Moss on the IT Crowd, except that he was massively cynical. Two things that stand out. When reading Macbeth, students were required to summarize each act. This student would annotate almost every sentence of his summary with at least a paragraph of snarky commentary that was surprisingly relevant and insightful, resulting in an assignment that should have been about 3 pages long, being at least 10, with 70% of it being commentary. I would hold a short story contest every semester. The requirement would have been to write at least 2 pages for the student's year. Student writes a 30-page saga about a man who is obsessed with a red-haired woman and her beauty until the day comes when he makes a pass at him on page 5. The last 25 pages are a detailed account of the protagonist's mental breakdown over her apparent lack of purity and his sexual insecurities, manifested in his believing his body is decomposing into his apartment floor, which is littered with sad bachelor food, followed by sequences of the character being trapped in bright white rooms with the sounds of clocks ticking and nothing more. Student who wrote this was 16 years old. Awesome kid. Would teach again. Story 41. I've been teaching for about a decade. I've taught a lot of smart kids, but there are 2 kids who are unquestionably geniuses. One of my 10th graders who was intimidatingly more intelligent than everyone around her, including her teachers. And this was a good school with well-pedigreed teachers. She knew it, and she was exceedingly polite to everyone, but you could see the frustration behind her eyes while she struggled to communicate an idea to someone who just wasn't getting it. Her papers on literature were far more organized and nuanced than papers I saw as a graduate student in my Ivy League graduate program, including layers upon layers of footnotes and annotations. She spoke 6 languages, with what I am told was equivalent fluency. Twi, this was her native language. She was Ghanaian, English, French, Spanish, which she picked up while living in an area with a large Latino population. Italian, which she taught herself after learning Spanish. And ecclesiastical Latin, which she taught herself at church because her uncle was a priest. She also was an expert coder, which she learned to do because she wanted to be a clothing designer and hated every app available to do so. So she created her own from scratch. She read philosophy for fun. Unfortunately, while she was socially skilled, she had the emotional maturity of a student her age and fell for a 20-year-old with a motorcycle and ran off with him rather than finishing high school. She's currently in a business program at a state school, but she could have gone to the tops of the tops if she wanted to. Story 42. One student in Vietnam had to miss a class because she was being honored at a ceremony in the capital for being one of the top 10 students in the country. She was very apologetic and wrote me a lovely letter explaining why she would be absent that day. Her brilliance showed in the way she could pick up any skill with minimal practice. I taught her English, although she was already more proficient than me. The most memorable way she convinced me she was a genius was when she learned to play piano, from nothing to writing her own original songs, complete with lyrics she sang while playing, in maybe a couple months. She was a wonderful person as well, kind and thoughtful to everyone. Story 43. I am a voice teacher, and I have a student that is just an absolute perfect example of aptitude. She innately understands the mechanics of her voice and can make small adjustments and improvements to technique in the space of an hour that would take most other students in her age. She is 15 months. Her athletic ability and innate body awareness is amazing. The sounds that she's able to produce, the brilliance of tone, the nimbleness of the voice, the musicality are years behind her age. But none of it is forced or manufactured. It just is. It's amazing. She works harder than any student I've ever had, and she eats, breathes, and sleeps repertoire. She constantly gobbles up operas, musicals, and symphonic stuff. I give her mammoth listening homeworks, and she just goes bonkers. She researches her own repertoire at a depth that I don't normally see in my college kids. It's incredible. Add to all that the fact that she's got the look, which actually totally matters for getting hired these days, and is a lovely girl with great presence and dramatic ability. I expect she'll be at the top of the field in 10 years. Story 44. Math teacher here. A few years ago, I had a student in my class who was a genius at languages. At age 16, he could speak and write 8 languages fluently, 2 of them being modern Arabic and Mandarin Chinese, and basically could pick up a new language and after a few weeks get a level that would take most people years to attain. He got good grades and in math because he was good at pattern recognition, but it was weird hearing him explain his reasoning. He just did what felt natural, he said, to him, and it just turned out that he was almost always right. And in the rare cases he wasn't, he furrowed his brow and fell in kind of a trance that suddenly his eyes lit up and went, "Of course!" But he couldn't easily explain what he had just understood. But he never made the same mistake again. I've had a few naturally talented students in my career, and several of them became actual mathematicians, but he is the closest thing I saw to otherworldly genius. Last I heard, he was pursuing graduate studies in linguistics. Story 45. I had a student about 8 years ago. I teach martial arts, by the way. She was maybe 8 years old. She picked up every movement so easily. She executed and applied each technique exactly how it was shown to her. Her memory was astounding, too. One day I decided to experiment and taught her a challenging form that would usually take maybe a month or so to teach properly. I taught her for about 10 minutes. By the following week, she was performing it better than I or any other instructor had. At tournaments, she always took first in both events. When she fought, we had to make sure she used extreme control because her speed, timing, and accuracy could seriously hurt a partner. When her parents took her out because of scheduling difficulties, I told her dad what a mistake he was making. She could have been one of the best. She was a genius. Story 46. Not the teacher, but fellow student. The kid got a perfect score on the ACT and SAT. That alone isn't all that impressive, I guess, but there was only one teacher in the entire school that could hold a conversation with this kid because he was just too smart to converse with normal people. The teacher was a math teacher, and he said the kid would listen for the first 10 minutes of class and then start programming his calculator to do everything for him. Last I heard, he was at the MIT working on cures for cancer, but that was 5 or so years ago. Story 47. I had a student who surpassed me intellectually. He was a genius with a photographic memory. I voiced my concern to his parents that his identity is entirely being smart and he is becoming too risk-adverse. They accused me of being jealous. I tried to give him more open-ended assignments so he could develop coping skills with failure and tried to shift the focus on the work and effort. Instead of instantly knowing something, he was moved from my class. He graduated, spiraled out of control, became addicted to drugs, and tried to hurt his family. I always feel anxious about the future of remarkably gifted students. Their future is more likely to be riddled with mental health issues and addiction. Story 48. My mother is a computer teacher for high school students, and I'm 10 plus years in the business front-end developer. One day she calls me about a week after a new semester and bluntly asks me for help. Of course, what for? Turns out she has a student who is some kind of coding genius, and she doesn't know what to do for him. He knows more than she does. So after getting some information, it turns out this kid, who gets fine to good grades in every other area of school, has taught himself, approximately age 14 to 15, several different coding languages. He came to her class because he hoped he might find something interesting. He didn't know HTML or CSS, so I suggested she start him on that. But since he wanted a challenge in coding, I thought maybe there was something better that could be done. I ended up suggesting that he could do a project that would be worth his grade, like what you do in college, and that idea was what my mom went to school with. Worked out really well for him. The kid ended up with a really good, well-coded project, which my mom ended up having checked by a college professor because she couldn't grade it. He could take it into college with him, basically self-taught himself throughout the year, and ended up sticking with HTML, CSS long enough to know how to do a basic website to present his final project, and he seemed quite happy. We had a very good relationship, much more than a teacher-student one, so I inquired after him many times, trying to find out what happened and if he was safe. After a while, he came back to school, but not as a student. His mother had recently died, so it fell to him to take care of his 3 younger siblings. His best friend, girlfriend, of 5 years broke up with him as she could no longer deal with his depression, and he was diagnosed with cancer. His long hair was gone at this point. He was having a very tough time and pretty much put his life on hold to take care of other people. I think it was more than that, though, as I noted several half-healed scars on his forearms, so I believe he also tried to commit suicide. I wish I could have done more to help him while he was here. Story 49. I once taught a student who had an uncanny ability to predict stock market trends. They were making substantial amounts of money while still in high school. However, their focus on financial gain led to a complete disregard for school rules and academic integrity. They saw education as a means to an end, using it solely to further their financial ambitions, which was unsettling. Story 50. I went to middle school and high school with a math genius. He was in the AP classes for other subjects, but for math, they had somebody from a local college, maybe a grad student they had went to high school or something, teach him higher level stuff. Our school taught him through AP Calc 3 and App Stats, so I'm guessing he was doing college level stuff like DiffEqs and such. I actually just Googled him a few weeks ago, and turns out he went to MIT and is now living in California, so I guess he's doing well. Also went to elementary school with another kid that had a similar situation, only since it was elementary school, I think they only had him to do geometry and pre-algebra while we were learning long division. He was kind of weird, like constantly fidgeting on his seat. Really nice kid, not like Asperger's breakouts or anything like that. I think he was just way too smart to be crammed at a desk. Not sure what happened to him. Right after elementary school, hopefully he went to somewhere that challenged him. Just look him up. He went to MIT also and is now working there. Story 51. I'm not a teacher, just wanted to share. I had a friend that was miles away from other very good students. He wasn't a genius in a way that he didn't really care for learning. So it wasn't like he knew a ton at an early age, but the best way to explain why I feel he was very different was that he didn't really just learn things. He got them. He understood them much better than anyone else. The biggest mind-blowing smart thing he did was on an English test. I'm not a native. He was a good student, but as I said, not very curious. So he was learning in class like everyone else, and he skipped a conjugation lesson that he needed for a test. He nailed the test, though. Even though he didn't know it when I asked how, he said it was only logical. There were a few examples between multiplies, exercises, so he understood how the whole thing worked because English is logical, so it was just making sense to him. It was in middle school. He also had a perfect memory, and it was impressive to me because I had a terrible one. I remember him referencing things I said to him years after. It was quite mind-blowing. He has a very big social issue, though, and I know he had health issues, even though I don't know exactly what they were. He wasn't passionate about much and was mostly bored all the time. Even though he couldn't really continue education due to many social issues, he self-taught himself programmation and works now in a job in a major company, so he did find a way. Story 52. I had a student in my band, instrumental director, who was a genuine musical prodigy. He started on saxophone but could pick up anything and just instinctively know how to play it. I ended up switching him to French horn and he loved it. I think it was the only instrument that ever gave him a challenge, but you wouldn't know it hearing him play that thing. He was incredibly gifted and would write all the time. As someone who has written his own fair share of music, we would just sit after school and talk theory and orchestration. He was young, so a lot of the intricacies of playing versus theory were a little new to him, but he picked them up like a champ. His junior year, he wrote a piece for our band that was way above playing level. We edited it together. I showed him how to write for younger bands. It's a challenge, and he ate it up. We ended up performing the piece at our district-wide festival that year, and it went off really well. He didn't want to conduct because he had written a killer horn part for himself, but I convinced him to give it a shot. He ended up really liking conducting, even if he couldn't quite wrap his head around the rehearsal part. It was just hard for him to understand that his fellow students just weren't operating at his level. And to be fair, I really wanted to play that horn part. It was radical. In all my years playing, making, teaching music, I've never met a student quite like him. He didn't go to college for music, but he's still very active with music at his university. We stay in touch every once in a while. He drops me a score he's working on and we'll workshop it together. He's a really good kid. Story 53. I'm not a teacher, but I genuinely believe my brother is an actual genius. When he was around 3, he got bored with adding and subtracting, so we taught him multiplication. Before we had a chance to move on to division, he taught himself using Lego Duplo and made up his own sign. I forget what it looks like, because he didn't know the real one. Again, at around 3, we started teaching him shapes. He wasn't happy with the basics. So we went on to learn a whole load of different shapes and the names for up to 20-sided shapes. Skip forward to when he was around 5. He learned as much about space as he could get access to. He had way more questions than we had answers to and discovered Google very early on, like from when he could talk properly. He learned the length of the days and years on the planets, the names of all the solar stars, and so much more. I struggled to keep up. There were loads of learning phases he had. Off the top of my head, I can only remember those properly. He learned the Roman numerals in a few hours and started doing math, substituting numbers for numerals. He learned how to translate numbers into binary code, age 7, I think, and taught his teacher, got a gold star. In his school, they have timed math tests where they have a sheet of 40 questions in varying difficulty. Could be 12 plus 19 or 8 times 6 and 90 seconds to see how many they can do. He got 38 on his best run. He's 9, will be 10 in February, so we're teaching him GCSE level math in the hopes he might be able to do it early. School is definitely holding him back and he's getting so bored. He can speak Welsh fluently too. Also, he knows the names and types of every Pokemon. Doesn't sound so impressive until you realize there's over 800. Story 54. I teach preschool special education. I was talking with the class about space in our solar system. A child who cannot read yet raised his hand and said, if the sun is called Sol, then that's why it's called a solar system. Because the planets go around the sun? I was like, yes, it is. And he continued, so solar panels are called solar because they collect the sun? Interesting. I was surprised at his connection and said, yes, and you will get a book to take home today all about the solar system. He returned the next day and had memorized all the names of the planets, their distance from the sun and each other, and the times it would take a rocket to reach his planet. We stumbled into his niche. He is now in second grade, but goes up to sixth grade for science class. Story 55. Once, this kid came in knowing more chemistry than I did, even with my bachelor's. Kid got a 4-year football scholarship to Brown to be pre-med. After about a month, I started using his tests and homework as my answer key. He thought it was funny. Great kid. Story 56. I teach science, chemistry, and biology in Australia. I'm a part of a program where I only work in disadvantaged schools, based on school performance and the SES status of the students. So the student body is, for the most part, not performing to a high standard. Now, I only started teaching 3 years ago. In one of my first classes was this young man, well, 15 at the age time, who we'll call Alex for the sake of anonymity. He absolutely aced every task I gave him. I generally had to explain things to him once, and he'd do the work faster than everyone else. Start an extension work, homework, then stay after class to ask me about furthering his understanding. Year 10 in Australia is very basic, but his questions went to a first-year university level at this point. He understood it perfectly. He was a very kind kid, too. I always noted how he'd go around the classroom when I was busy and help his classmates further their understanding. He even held homework clubs as exams drew near. Anyway, I'm rambling. The point was that he could absorb knowledge like nobody's business, and he could make connections to concepts well beyond his year's level. This is the part where I get a bit off topic, so I apologize. Now, Alex obviously had a very troubled home life. He worked a lot so he could pay for his own food, excursions, and school supplies, in addition to going towards rent and utilities. He lived with sharemates. He had scars on his face from physical abuse sustained as a child. He had always experienced homelessness where he was in year 11. Despite this, he completed 3 year 12 classes, ranking in the top percentile. So he was a tough, bloody kid. However, halfway through the first semester of this year, he stopped coming to school. Story 57. There was a student who had a photographic memory and could recall details from every book they had ever read. It was astonishing. But they used this ability to bully other students, often bringing up embarrassing or sensitive information in front of others. Their intelligence became a weapon, causing emotional distress to their peers. This is the end of the video. Thanks for watching.